is an AP World History project for the 5th time period.
Changes in functions and structures of the states and in attitudes towards states and political structure. After going through the horror of the wars, the government functions changed. In the pre-World War I era, war was glorified, and now the government is beginning to focus on protection of its citizens. In the West, the governments became and continue to be democracies, but in China, the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, and Latin America, communism was prominent. Some new patterns of nationalism include fascism, decolonization, genocide, racism, and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Fascism was turned to during the Great Depression. Fascism supports the idea that only the strong survive against the weak by being healthy, being vital, and putting themselves in conflict against the weak. It fed of the insecurities of the people and led to dictatorships. The main countries that it were in were Italy and Germany. After World War II, the majority of the nations involved began to give up their overseas colonies. Kenya and Ghana gained independence through their nationalist leaders. The U.S. gave the Philippines independence, and Europe also withdrew from their colonies in Africa and Asia. Racism was major during this time period. The U.S. was very segregated, and a leading civil rights activist was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Jews were discriminated against, especially during the Holocaust. South Africa was the last country to legally end apartheid.
Social systems and gender structures. India, with a strong Hindu tradition, was the only remaining society with a caste system. But in all societies, a gap is present between the rich and poor. Women's roles went up in most all places. They gained the right to vote, became more educated, and entered the workforce. They were very important as nurses during the wars. In countries that were still developing, women were still mainly confined to housework, and the population growth rate was relatively high, which kept the countries poor. The significance of social stratification continued to increase with capitalism. Equality became a bigger issue during this time period. Women started to fight for their rights. The women's suffrage and liberation movements brought more attention to the issues and also granted women with the right to vote and legal and social equality. Families are still patriarchal today. The father was generally the head of the family, which is still true today. There are many forces of revolution. The Russian Revolution began in 1917, which sparked communist revolutions throughout Europe. In the 80s, Lenin led revolts that prompted the fall of the Soviet Union. Mao Deng Xiaoping led the communist revolts in China that brought free market reforms. Castro led communist revolts with the assistance of the Soviet Union. A theocracy was established in Iran through Islamic revolts led by Khomeini. The roles and rights of women in Russia, China, and Cuba were theoretically equal with men, but that doesn't mean that it was its practice. In Iran, women got fewer rights as a result of the revolution. Peasants didn't revolt as much as they did in the medieval era. The peasants were hit the hardest in the times of war and economic troubles, such as the Great Depression. Marxism, which is the socialist beliefs of Karl Marx, rose in revolutionary communist parties globally. It played a major role in China, but then died. Religious fundamentalism, also known as the strict following of direct texts of religion, is present during this time period, but many aspects of religions like Christianity have somewhat adapted to modern times. Religious fundamentalism can be dangerous and as a result in acts of terrorism.
Diverse interpretations. Question number 1. Is the cultural convergence or diversity the best model for understanding increased intercultural contact in the 20th century? Cultural convergence is the best model for understanding the increased intercultural contact in the 20th century. As the world globalized, cultures experienced more contact with each other, and the cultures tend to assimilate. Two examples of this is the westernization of Japan through the Meiji Restoration and the global abundance of McDonald's. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using units of analysis in the 20th century, such as the nation, the world, the West, and the developing world? An advantage is that it allows someone to focus on important events and see how it impacts certain parts of the world. A disadvantage is that parts of the world are being grouped in a way that may not be uniform, because there aren't definite boundaries associated with these terms. Interaction, culture, and intellect. Science, technology, and culture are being globalized. Culture changes, grows, and adapts as time goes on, and technology continues to advance. In the U.S., this was a huge time for advancement. New technologies such as microwaves and toasters were beginning to be used in everyday life. All of this technology has allowed the U.S. to rise to number one. Western culture includes McDonald's, Walmart, and computers. This has spread around the world. The elite upper class develops its own distinguished culture, which today includes material items like the Mercedes cars. Paris was the artistic capital. American culture has widely spread through movies and music. Europe ended the Victorian era and transitioned into the modern era of architecture. Muslim fundamentalists rejected Western culture because they thought it was threatening. This could be some of the deeper roots of terrorism. Major comparisons and snapshots. Two similarities in the pattern of decolonization in Africa and India are that both areas were led to independence after World War II, and both split into various countries after achieving independence. One difference is that religious tension rose in India while tribal wars arose in Africa. Two revolutions that changed the status of women were Russian and Cuban. Prior to the revolution, 70% of Cubans were domestic servants, and in 1990, over half of the college graduates were women. After the Russian Revolution, the unemployment rate went up, and many of them were women. Now Russia has 100% employment, and Cuba has yet to achieve that. Effects of the world wars reached places outside of Europe. Japan's defeat prompted further it to modernize and westernize. The U.S.'s technology improved, especially with computers and nuclear weaponry. Summaries for cracking the AP exam. Fascism and totalitarianism are both political ideologies with dictators who control everything, but fascism leaders, such as Hitler, are extremely conservative, whereas totalitarianism leaders are extremely liberal or radical. Nationalism was present in Europe and its colonies. In Europe, nationalism meant expansion and imperialism, and in the colonies, it meant self-determination and independence. China has been dynastic and communist. Dynastic China valued Confucian philosophy, and a social hierarchy was emphasized. Communist China rejected traditional Confucian traditions, so the class structure disappeared and lands were redistributed, but women gained more rights. Guerrilla and high-tech are two different types of warfare. Guerrilla warfare is less efficient, but it is more mobile and the cost is low. It is usually used by more poor countries. High-tech warfare is more efficient and also very costly, so it's used by powerful nations like the United States. Globalization made operations smoother for NGOs, non-governmental organizations. These are non-profit agencies that provide relief services and advocacy during natural disasters and wars. Two of these are the World Bank and the Red Cross.